Let me know if y'all can't hear me okay. So we're going to talk about Vue, and off the bat, I want to apologize. The title's a lie. We're not going to be doing a whole lot of data visualization. I wanted to build a really basic bootleg Grafana component just as an excuse to explore Vue and learn about its API. And to dig into that a little bit, in this talk, it's going to be an example-driven survey of Vue. I'm not going to try and teach you Vue. It's only a 20-minute slot. And I also will do my best not to do any direct comparisons of Vue and other frameworks. I want to show you guys what you can do with Vue and allow you to draw your own conclusions. So let's take a look at what we'll be building, this bootleg Grafana component. It's really basic. It's a simple gauge, but it will give us just enough to see like what you can do with Vue and how Vue can make building things like this really easy. So let's talk about Vue. Vue is an open source front-end framework developed originally by Evan You. It's now started off as a passion project, now is developed by a team of developers. It is not backed by any major corporation. It's funded via community, something like Open Collective, or maybe it is Open Collective. It's a good thing or bad thing, depending on your personal politics, neither here nor there. Vue is solely concerned with the presentation layer of your front end. What that means is that it doesn't care how you do data fetching. It doesn't care how you structure your business logic. It's only concerned with like how you build your UI. And there's a lot of front-end frameworks that occupy that niche. What sets Vue apart is partially just its design philosophy, the goals that it strives to meet, and also its reactivity model. So we'll dig into that. Vue has three main design goals. First one being approachability. Approachability here just means having a low learning curve, being easy. The onboarding experience of Vue is fantastic. They have an official guide that takes about 2 hours to work through, and like once you're through with it, you know Vue and you can use it and build really cool things with it. Second goal is versatility. What this means is that you can use Vue as much as you want to. You can use it as just a basic library for peppering in little bits of interactivity in a page that's otherwise static. And then to the other extreme, you can use it as a framework for building a server-side rendered single-page application. And it runs that gamut really well. As an example, GitLab uses Vue, and they've essentially used it just as a drop-in replacement for jQuery. And they've had a lot of success with that, and they've talked about that on their engineering blog. Final bit is performance. Performance can mean a lot of things. We're going to focus on two things here. One is just bundle size. Vue 2 is 20 kilobytes gzipped. Vue 3, which is coming out in a couple of months, is aiming to stay under 10 kilobytes gzipped. So what that means is just by picking Vue, you're not forcing your users to pull down a ton of data into their browser just to view your page. The other bit of that is once the user actually has Vue loaded in their browser, doing things like DOM manipulation is incredibly fast. That isn't particularly special. Most modern front-end frameworks now are very fast. The thing that sets Vue apart here a bit is that you don't have to do a lot of hand optimization, and that's partially to the credit of its reactivity system. So let's dig into that. Vue's reactivity model is inspired by the model Vue model, Vue. I'm going to abandon that thread. But what it actually is doing here is, and what Vue enables is being able to think about your UI in terms of just data. You pass it, when you're creating a Vue element, you just pass it a plain JavaScript object that it will walk through and decorate this or walk through and add getters and setters on. The reason it does this is to do dependency tracking. For every Vue instance you have in your UI, it creates a watcher instance. What this means is whenever you mutate data in your Vue instance, Vue knows exactly what parts of the UI that it needs to re-render. It has a virtual DOM implementation, so that doing the actual re-rendering is very fast. It can do a minimal render, but this just eliminates a whole class of optimizations that you have to deal with in other frameworks. Oh, thank you. That you have to do in other frameworks. You don't have to be trying be smart about rendering. That you get that for free with Vue's reactivity system. So let's actually dig into the example. Our starting point is a really basic SVG drawing. It's comprised of 3 components. To start with, we have this background arc. It's just like what is the static part of the gauge. It won't move at all. If you're not familiar with SVG, when you want to draw a path, you just essentially give it a sequence of commands. Here's just, you can think of it as moving a cursor on the canvas to a certain point, and then we draw an arc. We'll dig into what the arguments mean. But yeah, the bit of our gauge that will actually represent the data looks incredibly similar. The only difference is that we're going to expand and contract that gauge by playing with the dash offset on this SVG array, the dash offset on this path. SVG is not like CSS borders. You have a lot of control over how it's rendered. The dash array is basically specifying a sequences of dashes and gaps. And that's how, when you ever see line animations on websites and it's using SVG, this is how they accomplish that. The one thing I wanted to call out here is just the path length attribute's really handy for doing these kind of animations. You don't actually have to know the length of the path. We are telling the browser this is what we consider the length of the path to be, and it will handle doing any scaling for us. So it prevents us from having to do, here it would just be basic trig, but for the other paths, it could be really annoying math. And the last bit is just the text component. It's that center bit on the drawing. I'm gonna skip over this just in the interest of time. One of the weird things about SVG is that when you specify an offset, like, so for doing these line animations, the offset is into the dash array. So you have the sequence of dashes and gaps. When you increase the offset, it'll shift it to the left, and when you decrease the offset, it'll shift it to the right. So that'll come up in some of the manipulations we'll do with Vue. And let's start adding Vue. In general, this is a place where I think Vue really shines. It lends itself well to just kind of just doing quick spikes and prototyping, and just kind of an iterative process. I like to think of components in terms of this is the data it will hold, then thinking about how it will actually display in the browser, and then layering on functionality on that for all the different states that component will show. So we're going to start just with a really basic Vue instance that holds a little bit of data. In Vue, when you're creating an instance, you essentially just pass a configuration object. It looks for, and it just looks for keys that are defined in its API. So here we have this element. This is just telling the Vue instance where to attach in the DOM. And then it's our data. This is what I was talking about, that data bit in Vue's reactivity model. This is the object that it's going to traverse and add the getters and setters on. And that's it for now. We will layer on functionality in a couple steps. Now, for defining how data should actually be shown and rendered on in the browser, Vue has a template DSL. You don't have to use it. If you like JSX, if you just want to write plain render functions, you can use that. But this is kind of going back to Vue's goal of being approachable and easy. Its template DSL looks almost exactly like HTML, just with some extra things for doing stuff like conditional rendering, list rendering, and data binding. So let's dig in. This is pretty similar to what we did with our SVG drawing. We just added a couple of things. We wrapped it in a figure with ID app. So Vue will mount onto this when it's in the browser. And then we add an input element. This input element will allow us to play with the state of the Vue component. And also lets me talk about Vue's two-way binding. So there's a couple of different ways to do data binding. A lot of frameworks will do one-way binding, two-way binding. If you're not familiar with that term, you can think of it as with two-way binding, you are sharing data through a pipe, and anyone can grab it and mutate it, and that will be shared among everyone. With one-way binding, you basically put a one-way valve on that pipe, so there is a source of truth that pushes out, and people can mutate it, but that won't get propagated back to anyone else. Two-way binding has fallen out of favor a little bit because it can lead to really complex, it can lead to it can make it hard to reason about the state of your application, how you got into a certain state when you're debugging. There are cases, though, when it's really useful, and especially for just doing form input binding. We want to take whatever is in this input component, in this input, and store that back into our Vue data. And the way we accomplish this is just with the vModel directive. It just has the name of our percent. If you're not familiar, directive is just a special token that you put on a DOM element that lets Vue know that there's something that it should be doing with this node. We're not going to touch the path arcs just yet. I just want to show you some basic data binding. And in our text component, we're substituting out that plain string for this, what's called a mustache syntax, just the double curly braces. Vue will take whatever's in here, evaluate it, and then insert the result of that into the DOM. So here I'll just draw out the percent that we had in our data. The last bit, I just ripped out the CSS and added some structural stuff. One thing I want to call out, just because I just learned about it and thought it was neat, the font variant numeric allows you to change the glyphs that the browser uses for the numbers. When we set it to tabular nums, it'll have all the font glyphs as monospace. So when that number is changing, it won't fidget on the screen. I thought it was neat. So what we have here is we see that 25 that we passed to the Vue instance initially. When we change what's in the input, when we change what's in this input text field, the number changes. And when this is Vue's reactivity system in work. We didn't have to define any DOM manipulations. We just solely expressed the data and how the data should be displayed. And Vue handled doing the actual DOM manipulation. And that's really neat. It's weird, though, that the arc isn't moving, so let's fix that. So for making the arcs reactive, it's only going to take 2 small changes. Another one of the keys that Vue will look for when you pass it the configuration object is this computed property. Computed properties are handy when you want to leverage Vue's reactivity system, but you also want to do a basic transform on the data that you're storing in your Vue instance. It allows you to keep your template relatively clean and free of expressions. And this is the first time we get to see Vue's reactivity system in code. You'll notice that we're not passing the percent as an argument to this function. What will happen is when this computed elements get evaluated for the first time, that watcher instance will register that arc offset has a dependency on the percent that's in our data that's in that data object. And whenever the data changes, Vue will know that it has to reevaluate this computed property. So we don't have to do any of that wiring, which allows us to keep these instances like really clean and expressive. And just a reminder, so we're offsetting into it, so that's why we're doing this the subtraction. And Vue has 2 different ways of expressing one-way binding. We have the mustache syntax, and then we also have this vbind directive. Here's just a prefix, but it's telling the browser for this element attribute, instead of passing it a fixed static value, we're saying whatever the arc offset is, map it to that. And that's it, 2 changes. And it works. When we change it, the arc updates. Again, we didn't do any DOM manipulations, but there's some problems. If we pass it, this is supposed to be a percentage. That's really basic. We can fix that pretty easily. The other thing is, if we pass it numbers that are outside the bounds of just like 0 to 100%, oh, that's not a good example. Let's do 99. And then if we go over that, the component doesn't make sense anymore. So garbage in, garbage out, but that's easy enough to fix. And one more other problem is if we don't pass in numeric values, it just completely busts. So this is pretty easy to fix, and I'll let us see some new things in Vue. We'll just use, for rendering that string with the percent sign, we'll just use a browser API. The nice thing about this is it'll render that string locale appropriate. We're defining this outside of the our Vue instance, since that it's not a computed property. We'll see it in a second. It's a filter. That filter will be evaluated a lot, and we don't want to blow up garbage collection. Filters are similar to computed properties. We can use them in our template. The difference is that filters don't directly leverage reactivity. Instead, they are just basically pure functions. You pass it a value, it'll do a transform on it and spit it back out. So it's handy in places like in this case where we want to pass it a number and then spit out a string. And the way we use filters is just with this pipe operator. And you can compose them together if you like. And so for the second bit, protecting the component from garbage data, sanitize is a bad name. Vue by default will handle input sanitization. You don't have to worry about users doing code injection. However, here it's just talking about preventing the user from giving us basically garbage that will break the component. This is a new property that we haven't seen yet. It's just called methods. With this methods object, we can pass user-defined methods that are bound to the Vue instance, and then we can use elsewhere in the component as well as in our template. And what's going on here is really pretty simple. It's expecting an event. It'll try and coerce that to a number and then try and clamp it. The way that we will use this in our template is a new directive called von. When you want to bind to DOM events for some given element in your template, you can use this attribute or this directive. It'll be von and then the event that you want to bind. So whenever this input element emits input events, our sanitize% method will be invoked on that event. I said event a lot, apologies. But that's all the wire up we have to do. And now when I try and break it and give it garbage data, it'll clamp it. If I try and go below, and if I type in a number, or if I type in letters, it just defaults it to a known good value. And our filter's working. So running over time real quick. It works, but we're gonna make it pop. This is just mostly to show you how it's pretty easy to combine Vue with third-party libraries and how you can leverage Vue's reactivity system with third-party libraries, and it leads to cool things. Chroma is just a JavaScript library for doing color manipulation. Here, we're just taking a color space and creating a map to numerical values so that as the gauge fills up, the color will change. We're just using a colored computed property. We've already seen this. Again, leveraging Vue's reactivity system here. And to use it, you already know how to use it in the template. Vue offers shorthand syntax for things. So if you want, you don't have to write out vbind. You can just have that colon prefix on the attribute that you want to have bound. And then this is something new. Just want to show you can animate the data in this component. Vue's reactivity system is really nice, but there are cases where reacting just to the change in state isn't enough. You need a little bit more generic mechanism to react to changes in data. Vue exposes that via the watch properties. Watch properties, the way we use watch properties is we just write a function that has the percent of the name of the, as a function that has the same name as the data that we want to watch. It gets invoked whenever that piece of data changes with a new value. So that is not yet updated, but it's about to. When we're inside this, we can update data imperatively. So we're no longer leveraging Vue's reactivity here. But sometimes we can't. Sometimes computed properties just aren't enough. So TweenLight is just a tweening utility from a library called Greensock, which is just a nice JavaScript library for doing animations in the browser. And just wanted to call out two things here. Whenever you see an element prefixed with a $sign that's bound to your instance, that means it's coming from Vue directly. It's not user-defined. And since we're defining the arc offset now imperatively, it's no longer a computed property, so we have to keep track of it in our data object. In general, you want to leverage computed properties when they can, because it just keeps things cleaner and easier to think about, but sometimes you need watch properties. And just want to call out here that we didn't have to change anything in our template. Vue doesn't care if it's computed property or if it's data. And we got what I showed you guys in the beginning. It works. There's tweening going on, and the color changes. So that's about it. What I hope you walk away with is that you can do a lot with Vue with relatively little code. It makes things easy, and it's super easy to pick up. Really encourage you just to check out the official guide for Vue. And also just, even if you don't care about Vue, you can do a lot with SVG and just a little bit of JavaScript. So have fun. And thank you guys so much.